It was late in the winter of 1980, and the sidewalks of the Upper East Side of Manhattan were wet with melting snow. A yellow glow spilled from the windows of a small club on First Avenue, a place called Dangerfield's, where the laughter rarely stopped before 2 in the morning. Inside, the room was warm and crowded, thick with cigarette smoke and the clink of glasses against tabletops. And near the back, half hidden in the shadow of the coat rack, stood a man in a plain black jacket. There was gray in his beard now. His hair was pulled back. He had not told anyone he was coming, and he had not asked for a table. George Carlin had walked into that club alone, and he had no intention of ever stepping onto the stage. But the man under the hot lights, holding the microphone, was Rodney Dangerfield. And when Rodney's eyes drifted to the back of the room and found that familiar, tired face, something happened that no one in the audience understood. He stopped. Mid-sentence, mid-joke, the loudest room on the East Side went quiet, and for a moment the man famous for saying he got no respect simply stood there under the light, looking at an old friend he had not seen in a very long time. To understand why Rodney Dangerfield stopped that night and what he was about to do, you have to go back 20 years, to a time when neither of these men was anybody at all. By 1980, George Carlin was not the man the public imagined him to be. To the world, he was a giant, the fearless comedian who had changed what a person was allowed to say out loud on a stage. But the years behind him had been hard, in ways his audiences never saw and never suspected. In 1978, his heart had failed him for the first time. He had lain in a hospital bed at 50 and stared at the ceiling and wondered, quietly, whether all the laughter had ever really been worth it. His career had cooled. The specials had slowed. There were money troubles, the private kind, the kind a proud man does not talk about at parties. And there were the other battles, too, the long nights, the substances, the strain on a marriage that had already survived far more than most. He was tired. Not the tired of one bad week, but the tired that settles deep into a man's bones after 20 years of walking into rooms full of strangers and asking them, night after night, to love him. So on that cold winter night, when he found himself standing near Dangerfield's, he did not come to be seen. He came because a warm, loud room full of easy laughter felt like the only safe place left in the whole city. He wanted to stand in the back, unnoticed, with a drink he might not even finish, and just remember what it had all felt like, when it was still new and nothing hurt yet. He did not expect to be recognized, and he certainly did not expect what Rodney Dangerfield was about to do. In the early 1960s, before the specials, before the fame, New York City was full of young men trying to make strangers laugh for a living. It was a brutal way to earn $1. The clubs were small and smoky and half empty. The pay was almost nothing. A comedian could stand in front of a room of tired faces and feel the silence press in on him like cold water rising to his chest. George Carlin was one of those young men. He wore a suit and a narrow tie back then, and he told clean, clever jokes about radio and television, the kind of tidy act that might get a young comic a few minutes on a late-night show. And there was another man working those same rooms, though he was older than nearly everyone else in them. His real name was Jacob Cohen. He had tried comedy once as a young man, failed at it, quit, sold aluminum siding for years to feed his family, and then, deep into his 40s, crawled back to the only thing he had ever truly loved. He had given himself a new name for the second try: Rodney Dangerfield. The two of them, Carlin and Dangerfield, crossed paths in those years the way struggling people always do, in late-night diners and cramped backstage hallways, sharing cigarettes and complaints and the particular loneliness of men who are paid to be funny and go home alone. Neither of them knew yet that they would both become legends. What they knew was that the business did not want them, and that is a bond that does not break easily, no matter how many years go by. For a long second, the room simply did not understand what was happening. Rodney had been in the middle of a bit, the crowd roaring, the timing perfect, every beat landing exactly where he wanted it. And then he had just stopped. The microphone drifting away from his mouth, his eyes fixed on something at the back of the room that no one else could see. The laughter trailed off into a confused murmur. People turned in their seats to follow his gaze. A waitress froze in place with a tray of drinks balanced against her hip, unsure whether to keep moving. At the back, George Carlin realized with a sinking feeling that he had been seen. He gave a small shake of his head, a quiet, "Please, no, don't." He had come here to disappear, not to be pointed at in front of 100 strangers. But Rodney was already lifting the microphone back to his lips, slowly, deliberately, the way a man does when he has made up his mind about something and will not be talked out of it. And the crowd, sensing that something entirely unplanned was about to unfold in front of them, went still in the particular way a room only goes still when it knows, somehow, that it is about to witness something real. Whatever was coming next had not been written into anyone's act. There was no punchline waiting. There was only an old debt, a crowded room, and two men who had traveled a very long road from those cold diners of the early 60s. Rodney took a breath, and then he said the thing that changed the shape of the entire night. By 1980, Rodney Dangerfield had finally, impossibly, made it. After decades of failure, after selling siding and giving up and starting over from nothing in his 40s, he had somehow become one of the most beloved comedians in all of America. The bulging eyes, the tugging collar, the four little words that made a whole nation laugh out loud. I get no respect. But the most remarkable thing Rodney ever built was not his own fame. It was that club. He had opened Dangerfield so that young comedians would have a place to stand, a stage that would not chew them up and spit them out the way the business had very nearly destroyed him. He remembered every young comic who had ever been cold and broke and hungry, because he himself had been all of those things for longer than anyone should have to be. And he never forgot the people who had been kind to him back in the lean years. He never forgot who had shared a cigarette when he had nothing in his pockets. He never forgot who had told him, in a diner at 3 in the morning, that he was genuinely funny, that he should not quit, that his time would come if he could only hold on. George Carlin had been one of those people. So when Rodney looked toward the back of his own club that night and saw Carlin standing there in the shadows, gray and tired and trying so hard not to be seen, he did not see a legend at all. He saw the young man in the narrow tie who had believed in him when almost no one else on earth did. And Rodney Dangerfield was not a man who let a debt like that go unpaid. He could have turned and walked straight out the side door into the slush of First Avenue, and no one in that room would have blamed him for it. Instead, slowly, almost against his own will, George Carlin began to walk toward the stage. The room broke into applause, but it was not the wild, hungry applause of a comedy club. It was something softer than that, and warmer. The sound a room makes when it suddenly understands that it is watching two old friends and not two famous men. He climbed the single small step up onto the stage. Rodney did not reach out to shake his hand. Rodney put both arms around him. This man the whole country knew for getting no respect. And he held on to him the way you hold on to someone you had been quietly afraid you might never see again. And then Rodney stepped back into the dark at the edge of the stage and left George Carlin standing there alone in the light. Carlin looked out at the room for a long moment. He did not tell his famous jokes. He did not do the 7 words. He talked very quietly about being young and broke in this city. He talked about the diners, the cheap cigarettes, the men from those years who never made it out. He talked about Rodney, about being told your time will come by a man who had every reason in the world to have already given up on his own. The room did not roar. The room listened. Some of them, the older ones, had tears standing in their eyes and did not bother to wipe them away. For 11 minutes, George Carlin was not a legend at all. He was just a man, home again in the only kind of place that had ever really understood him. "Ladies and gentlemen," Rodney said, his voice low, almost gentle, a voice the crowd had never once heard him use. "There is a man in the back of the room tonight. A man who, when I had nothing, when I was ready to quit this business for good and go back to selling siding, looked me in the eye and told me I was funny. A man who stood in these same freezing rooms with me years ago when both of us were nobody at all." The audience still did not know his name, but they could feel the weight of the words settling over the tables like snow. Then Rodney did something that no headliner in the world ever does. He turned and gestured toward the stage, toward the light, toward his own place under it, and he said, simply, "This is George Carlin, and this stage is his tonight if he wants it." For a moment, nobody in the room moved at all. At the back, Carlin stood frozen, the gray in his beard catching the edge of the light. He had come here to hide. He had come because he was tired, because his heart had nearly stopped beating 2 years before, because the business he loved had taken more from him than it had ever thought to give back. And now the entire room had turned, every single face aimed toward the shadow where he stood, waiting to see what he would do. Rodney held the microphone out across the little stage, an offering, a hand reaching all the way back across 20 years. And George Carlin had a choice to make. When it was finally over, there was no big finish, no closing punchline. George Carlin simply said, "Thank you," quietly into the microphone, and stepped back down off the stage, and the two men stood together for a moment at the very edge of the light. No one filmed it. There is no recording of that night anywhere. The people who were there carried it home with them in their memory and told it later the way you tell a story you are not entirely sure anyone will believe. The two of them would go their separate ways again after that, back into their separate fames. Carlin would recover and reinvent himself once more and go on to create some of the greatest work of his entire life. Rodney would keep his club open, keep handing young comics their very first stage, keep telling the whole world he got no respect, while quietly earning more of it than almost anyone alive. But something had passed between them in that room that neither man ever fully explained to anyone. Because underneath the fame, underneath the fearless stage personas the public thought they knew, they were still just two men from the cold rooms of the early 60s, who had once had nothing in the world but each other and the stubborn, foolish belief that they were funny.
Rodney Dangerfield spent his entire life telling the world he got no respect. But on one winter night in 1980, in a crowded little room on First Avenue, he gave the deepest respect one man can ever give another. He gave up his own light, and he let his old friend stand in it. And the room, which had come only to laugh, went home that night having seen something it would never forget.